Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed trauma recovery coach, and I have with us today Tracy Hannigan. Tracy is a qualified sleep therapist who works exclusively with adults with insomnia via Zoom. Tracy's approach is focused on evidence-based practice, and she is one of the few people in the UK who are recognized by the Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine. In her healthcare practice as a registered osteopath, she uses her psychology background and training to help others get better sleep. Having had insomnia herself, she understands what it's like to both suffer and recover from long-standing sleeping problems. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us here today. Let's just dive right in a little bit of your story, because you've dealt with and you've healed from, and then you've come back to help people, which is a very similar story to a lot of coaches that I am colleagues with. So same kind of thing. How did you land here today?
Right. Well, quite a circuitous journey, but the abbreviated version is that I had a couple of bouts of insomnia in my younger years. So first one was after the death of my husband. And of course, we would all say something like that would definitely disrupt your sleep, but it went on for years. So it changed its flavor from a stress response to something that was more self-perpetuating. And I'll mention that again a bit later.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how I had gotten through that one until I got through my second one. So eventually I got better, and I had a second bout, and I was a bit more strategic about how I went about after putting myself through waiting long enough, trying lots of things that didn't work. Finally got strategic, and went through going through the process, the same kind of process that I tend to lead people through. It was not known as cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia or ACT for insomnia, which it now is, but there's now 30 years of evidence behind it. And I've always had an evidence-based bent to the work that I do, because I particularly did the slimy sales pitches for things to try to scare people into using a product or a service. So I kind of stick to the evidence, stick to what works. My clients really seem to benefit from it. And so having had that personal experience and having an opportunity to create a space for people, I did more special training because I have a background in psychology, worked in community mental health for a long time, layered on some additional sleep training, specifically with the approaches that helped me. And now I help other people. Like you said, journey that a lot of people pass through.
Yeah. I love when your strategy part came in, where it's like, we need to really get a handle on this. So some of those sleep-based programs that you're talking about, ACT and CBT, right? But specifically for insomnia, is it different from your regular, because it's called CBTI and ACTI, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it specifically using those same principles, but applying it to sleep, or is it a little bit different flavor there?
Yes, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because CBT, for example, has a lot of flavors. There's
Yes.
CBT aimed at helping people with depression, with anxiety, with pain. The insomnia element with CBTI, there is a piece of CBT, the kind of classic cognitive behavioral therapy within it,
Yes.
but there's also an element of helping people restructure their routines. And I'm not talking about sleep hygiene, but routines related to the association that they develop with their bed, for example. So before we have sleeping issues, we have a bed-sleep relationship. If we have long-standing sleeping issues, it becomes, this is where the battleground happens. I go to bed and this is where I fight. So working to change that and restore that relationship, but also make sure that people are doing what they need to do to keep their sleep drive high and their arousal low. So those pillars are really important. I personally use a lot of ACT elements and mindfulness elements in my work, because I find that cognitive restructuring and in classic CBT doesn't always hit on the head. It's very eyebrows up.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I just think that those additional elements have been a real game changer for people.
Yeah. What does ACT offer that is different from CBT when it comes to this, right? Because it's cognitive behavior therapy versus the acceptance therapy. This moving into does it have to do more with the acceptance and just letting be and it being okay and not trying to make so much change?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Mm,
acceptance doesn't necessarily mean that we throw our hands up and, don't do anything about the issue.
yeah.
But especially things like the element of ACT that is really helpful is making values-based choices for what you want to do with yourself, despite the fact that you are having an issue.
Yeah.
Now, purist CBT people have said to me, I don't want to generalize to everybody. There have been a few people who have said, well, there's conflict between using CBT and ACT. Actually, it's probably more that the people who are very much into ACT,
Yeah.
because cognitive restructuring is trying to change things.
Yeah.
But I do think sometimes people have a light bulb moment through conversation, not necessarily very structured CBT, where that light bulb goes off and it makes the rest of it a little bit easier. It makes acceptance of discomfort a little easier. It makes making values-based choices, like I still want to go do these things, even if I'm tired, a bit easier.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. The calming element too with ACT, I've actually done personally because I have a whole chronic mess of GI issues, which a lot of trauma survivors do: sleep, migraines, inflammatory issues, autoimmune disorders, and GI issues. And I've taken some GI behavioral classes actually, and they're kind of rooted in the ACT method versus the CBT method because you might not be able to change your biomechanics. You might not be able to change those physiological things that are happening and symptoms and all that kind of the pain, the chronic pain. And so it's almost there's a calming element that comes from this is where I am right now.
Mhm.
And then CBT can come in later and go, and here's how right now we can implement a few changes. And tonight,
Yeah.
here I am. So I would imagine there's a bit of, for you, it sounds like you're kind of titrating between the two. Although I'm sure there's some purists. I have heard that they kind of, I was in the class and I know more about CBT than I do ACT. So being in the class, I would raise my hand and I'd be like, but what about? And they'd be like, that's a little bit more CBT. We're going to really just focus on. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Mm,
I noticed the difference
mm,
myself, but you're kind of
mm.
titrating between the two of them, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'd say I use a bit more ACT, a bit more kind of the mindfulness element, a bit more focus on dropping the struggle.
Yeah.
We can still do the things that we need to do in that space of acceptance. And sometimes the things that we need to do are, I need to figure out how to maybe think about this a little bit differently, or might benefit from remembering that not all of my nights are bad nights,
Yes.
or that I've had bad days for other reasons. It's not all just sleep. So there are great elements to having that as part of the conversation. I think
Mm,
a lot of the epiphanies come more through the type of work. And if we can't change a situation, at least that approach helps us drop the struggle. So we're conserving our energy and we're
yeah.
still living the best life that we can in the meantime
Yeah.
while we're working on the recovery element.
Yeah.
And I think that's really powerful. If we look at what changes something like a stress response, sleeplessness, like after bereavement, after something's happened,
Yeah.
what makes some people more prone to developing longer term sleeping issues? It
Yes.
is in if we're talking about kind of like a fight flight response, or like that hypervigilance, that safety brain looking for danger,
Yeah.
if it perceives the danger to be the sleeplessness based off the stress reaction itself, then you get stuck in this cycle where it perpetuates itself because
Yeah.
the arousal goes up, the sleep quality or the duration becomes poor. We get more worried about it, and then we get more, and then the sleep gets worse, and we get stuck in that.
It's reminding me of the Buddhist philosophy, right? Like the suffering is always in the middle, right? So you've got one thing that you want, but you can't have it, but you're striving to get it, but you missed it, and you're stuck in the middle going, I don't like it here. And like you're suffering because you're trapped really in a push-pull kind of middle. And that is exactly true, right? Wanting something to be different when it can't exactly be different right this second, letting that go and just kind of being there. So you're kind of starting to touch a little bit on this idea of when you've had something that's going on, there's a safety element here, or there's a grief happening, maybe some overthinking, OCD tendencies. A lot of trauma survivors suffer with cognitive things like OCD, ADHD, ASD. How is that treatment different for someone who has gone through trauma and it's really related to their insomnia?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you look at the research and where, particularly CBTI research done in the early days, it was developed and systematized as a process to work specifically with traumatized veterans. So
Interesting. Oh my goodness.
yes, yes. So there are lots and there's lots out there on that. But
Yeah.
if doing CBTI specifically, the CBTI element does not change. Where it changes for me, though, because I am not a licensed psychologist, I am not don't have it to have it as long as I'm working with somebody who is within whose situation's within my scope.
Yes.
That makes it different for me because I can't quote unquote treat OCD. I can't quote unquote treat PTSD, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of overlap between a lot of these things, of course, not only in the person's experience, but there are in terms of techniques that are used in approaches and the conversations that are had. So it can kind of disseminate out. But what I think is really interesting is that the CBTI is helpful for people who have PTSD and sleep related issues because of it, because some of the same things that perpetuate or make the sleeping issue worse are things that are amenable to CBTI treatment.
That makes
Same
sense.
with CBTI and pain,
Yeah.
because the pain might wake a person
Mm.
or make it difficult to fall back to sleep. And so if we have that level of wake and response and relationship with sleep, it's then the almost the hyper arousal element of it that says, and this is really bad, and then this is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and I have to spend longer in bed so that I can get more sleep. All of those things make sleep worse.
Yeah.
And so that's what sleep therapy tends to focus on. So I mentioned CBTI specifically because of the research base with PTSD, but ACT is also now right up there with years of research behind it.
I love that. The PTS element is interesting because with trauma survivors, it could have even been all the way back to childhood. I'm thinking about like sexual trauma, or if there's alcoholism in the family, right? A lot of times a drunken parent might come home, come in guns ablazing with their kids, yelling at them because this didn't get done, that didn't get done, right? So where sleep was so traumatic or possibly even abusive, to be in bed, to be in room, is there help in changing atmosphere? Is it all just kind of retraining the brain? Is it using that neuroplasticity? What are some of those little tips and tricks that you might use for someone who's really had trauma, specifically in nighttime?
Changing of context is hugely helpful, trauma or not. And when we're talking about that relationship with the bed,
Yeah.
one thing that often happens is that people will feel safer or more comfortable or feel there's less pressure on themselves to get a good night's sleep if they, for example, fall asleep on the sofa,
Yeah.
right? Because the bed has become associated with the struggle and it's easier to sleep on the sofa. The issue is if that person ever wants to sleep regularly in their bed again, they have two things to deal with. One is still not being able to sleep well in bed, and also having to resist the temptation to sleep on the sofa while they're working through the process. So change of context in this situation might mean reorient your bed, push it up against the wall, put the headboard on the opposite side, put the windows in a different place, repaint the room. There are lots of different ways to change small contextual cues
Mm.
that can make a big difference. Interestingly, decluttering a bedroom is really
Yes.
helpful for people's sleep as well. It's like that safety radar has less stuff to look for, like where the predator's hiding almost. Yes, and it creates a calmer physical context. So it creates a calmer mental context.
I love that. There's so much to be said too for things like night terrors and nightmares, which we know survivors can oftentimes struggle with, even if it wasn't something like sexual abuse or middle of the night mayhem or dysfunction, just in general, like you were talking about, like grief and loss, because your brain is going, and then your brain is really trying to fix and process things. And
Mm.
so while it's sleeping, it is trying to do that. It's trying to compartmentalize things and kind of defrag itself and put things where they belong. And every night here comes this grief element or this trauma element, and there's just still no place to put, no box to put this in. So it ends up kind of coming to us in some night terrors, nightmares. We hear of a lot of like reoccurring dreams that happen with trauma survivors where they're almost trying to kind of complete something that happened to them, kind of complete it and process it. So what would you recommend for people who might be struggling in that arena with nightmares?
Imagery rescripting therapy.
Imagery, say that again?
Imagery rescripting.
Therapy.
It's
Okay, it's a
sometimes called
specific.
imagery. It's sometimes called imagery rehearsal. It's the more repetitive the nightmare, the more effective the therapy is, as from my own experience. It is basically you hit the nail on the head. It is used to literally rewrite and recomplete
Yeah.
the dream so that it omits the more traumatic, more upsetting elements.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense. That's a really great. So that's a specific type of modality that you're using with your
Yeah,
clients to kind of
yeah.
move through some of those
Mhm.
things. Yeah, especially if they can remember them. What if you don't remember them? What if you just wake up and you're in a panic attack? Now you probably had a dream about something, or maybe it's your nervous system just activating. But what if you don't have an imagery or something happening and you just wake up in a panic or a terror?
So, night terrors aren't often remembered because of the place in sleep where they tend to happen, but almost the same as with nightmares. It's almost like the brain gets into this habit loop of experiencing it.
Hmm.
Things that have emotional content are very reinforcing for the creation of a habit.
Yeah.
That's why the dream is always repetitive. Now, interestingly, with children, and I'm sure this is the same with adults, but I would have to check this. Night terrors happen in the same section of the night, the same cycle in the dream. Like we have several cycles, maybe it's cycle number 3. It
Yeah.
always happens in stage 3 sleep in that third cycle, for example, because that's the loop that is playing out. And with children, although I don't work directly with children, what they recommend is that you set an alarm to wake the child up before the night terror occurs, because it's almost time it on the clock. Wake
Wow.
the child up. So then they have to start again and they won't experience it.
Oh my goodness, that's really interesting. I've heard a lot of research about people waking up if you're struggling with any kind of nutrition deficiency,
Mhm.
where if you're hungry, you'll wake up in the middle of the night. It's almost always between like 1:30 and 3:30 in the morning, and then you get stuck awake
Mm.
because you're actually hungry, and so your brain's trying to wake you up. And it tends for certain people if it's like at 2:15 or 1:37, it's like almost always the same time, even for something like a biological need like that. So I can imagine
Mm.
that's really interesting research with the
Yeah,
night
yeah,
terrors.
yeah.
That's
It brings in the circadian rhythm element because we have lots of rhythms on a 24, 25-hour cycle.
yes.
And some of them are not meant to run together. And
Yes.
eating and sleeping obviously are not ones that are supposed to run together, because we're sleeping, we can't be eating, right?
Exactly.
But you're right. If we have issues, metabolic issues, dietary issues, nutritional absorption issues, and that can create a situation where the brain is saying, I need some more, please. A bit more glucose, please. And it makes you hungry and wakes you up.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The frustration there, I'm sure, is so real for people who struggle. I've had a bit of that where I would wake up with different, not necessarily scary dreams, but similar dreams that would happen always around that like 2:30 something time. And it's
Mhm.
so interesting because if you get thinking about it, there comes back in that struggle place. Now
Yes.
you're thinking about it. You're like, oh, I hate when this happens. If you don't have a place of, okay, we woke up and we're going to go back to sleep, and just staying really in
Yeah.
that calm place. So when I would wake up and I'd be very hyper about it, like, oh, not again, oh my god, I'm going to be awake for hours, immediately now I'm awake for hours. So it's
Yes,
really the
exactly.
retraining of how also you were responding to yourself with the grace and
Exactly.
compassion. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I'm perimenopausal. A lot of my clients are perimenopausal.
Same.
Waking up in the middle of the night, but having a hot flush, for example. Sleep therapy is really effective,
Yeah.
even for men going through those. Now, it won't necessarily stop all of the symptoms from happening,
Right.
but it changes the response that we have to the wake up that's
Yeah.
associated with the symptom. And interestingly, if you take, they took groups of women and they split them into groups and they studied acupuncture, menopause symptom education, and CBTI.
Wow.
And I assumed, of course, that the CBTI would smash the others out of the park with in terms of sleep improvement, and it did. But interestingly, those women complained of fewer symptoms as well. They complained
Wow,
of fewer
interesting.
symptoms. So if we imagine that having those symptoms is made worse by stress,
Right.
if we're lowering our stress levels because the context is our response has changed to that trigger of the wake up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just very interesting. And in cultures where it's not pathologized to have hot flushes, when you start pushing toward the middle of life,
Yeah.
they also complain of fewer symptoms because they just they don't have the same response to it. I think yes, we have symptoms. Yes, they are legitimate. Yes, they have really big impacts, and some women are completely debilitated by them. But
Yes.
we don't do ourselves any favors in necessarily the way that we respond. Just the same exact way, as you said, you wake up in the middle of the night. Nobody looks at the clock at 3 in the morning and says, "Yay, I've gotten 4 hours of sleep." Nobody does that. They all say, "Oh no, I've only gotten 4 hours of sleep," or "Oh, I only have 3 hours till the alarm goes off." And yeah, people always ask, "What's your number one tip?" Just don't look at the clock at night. Just gives you a place to anchor that kind of reaction. And
Yes.
then
Yeah.
suddenly you're waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning all the time.
Right. Because your mind is like thinking about it.
Because
Oh,
yeah,
remember how we keep waking up at three
yeah,
o'clock? Remember that?
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Our arousal system is baked into the physiology of how we sleep. It kept us from being eaten by predators. If you're laying there for 8 hours solid, you're a pretty easy target. We
Yeah.
come up, we scan for safety, we roll back into deeper sleep. We come up, we come back down. If we come up and we go, "Oh my goodness, it's 3 in the morning," the brain remembers that and says, "Oh, there was a tiger in the room. We better make sure that we wake up and really look for that tiger." And of
Yeah.
course, then we check the clock again. And then it's like, it's a mystery. Like, why is it always 3 o'clock in the morning? And on the
Exactly.
cycle goes.
And on and on. I do hear this repetitive cycle that has so much to do with the attitude and the mindset behind it. The work that I do, not just as a trauma recovery coach, but I also work as a lifestyle design coach for trauma survivors.
Mm.
And the pillars of lifestyle design, such as sleep, such as eating, such as activity, and social health, emotional health, career, just play, rest, all of these important things, they really the reason it's so important to have these pillars in good alignment is because the congruency together is going to make a big difference, right? Like you're talking about, diet that can then wake you up in the middle of the night. If you don't get a good enough sleep, you're waking up in the morning, you're really groggy, you're setting yourself off on a much more dysregulated place, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm always preaching with the lifestyle design. And I have heard, and I love this, that in some cultures, and some people have adopted it for their personal just self, is starting your day with your nighttime routine. That starts a new day rather than midnight starting your next day. It's that bedtime routine. Then you take this really long rest and then you wake up, but your day really started here because sleep is just that important to how
Mhm.
the rest of your day actually goes. So, what
Yeah.
would you say to that? Having a really solid bedtime routine, what are some tips and ideas there for really, maybe even if people don't want to consider it the start of their day, but really just the start of their healthy night, the best night they can get?
Yeah. I really, really like just I love that concept of that this is when your day starts, because a lot of people think that this is when night starts in this nighttime routine. And really, the sleep cycle begins in the morning. Get
I
up and you get moving. And
yes,
I'm a big believer in using that space, not to immediately jump into emails and
yeah,
doing this and doing that, but to have that as a space to set yourself up for a better day.
yeah,
When it comes to nighttime routines, there are things that are neutral, right? That anything can be neutral,
yeah,
like pulling the blinds so that the room is dark could be neutral. Putting on your comfy pajamas or taking off your clothes or however you sleep, it can be neutral. Brushing your teeth can be neutral. Having a bath an hour before bed can be neutral. But it can backfire if we have a strict routine that we feel we must follow, or else sleep won't happen
right.
because
Because now you're getting worried.
it's being driven by the fear of not sleeping, which actually makes sleep more challenging. Using the blinds as an example, pulling the blind is neutral, right? Some people are more disrupted by light than others.
Yeah.
I never pull this blind, so in the summer it's broad daylight in here from 4 in the morning until like 10 o'clock at night. It
Wow.
doesn't bother me. People can stay, darkness isn't necessary, right? But if you are taping your blinds to the window to keep every photon of light out,
Yeah.
Light's not what's keeping that person from sleeping well. That little bit of light that's coming in at the bottom there, it's not keeping that person awake. It's the fear of the light and what that means and the meaning it's given that creates challenges for people. So what I would say is approach the evening as time for yourself.
Mm.
So you've done work and you've done dinner and you've done family things. Spend a little bit of time doing something that you enjoy doing. Don't do something that you hate simply because you think it's going to help you sleep better. Um, Approach that period, particularly if there's a bit of challenge with sleep, as I'm going to go up to bed to rest rather than putting pressure on having to sleep. I have to get to sleep. So I have to sleep. I have this thing tomorrow. No, I'm going to go upstairs. I'm going to rest. Take the pressure off. But I think looking at that time as a place to put things into your life,
Yeah.
as opposed to taking things out and I can't do that and I have to do that. Far more attitude is far more helpful and creates more space for good things to come into it
Yeah.
than something that is really rigid.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. Your whole message is really about mindset and mindset shifting, which is really powerful. I think especially for survivors who are kind of in this, well, I've just never been a good sleeper. You know, I've had trauma since childhood, and it's the dysfunctional family, and oh, there was always this, and I've just never slept well. I'm just never going to be able to sleep well. Just even changing how they talk about it,
Language is powerful.
yeah,
Powerful.
it's really a game changer. So I like this idea of like having a wind down time for yourself, building in some pleasure and some space. I know that for some survivors, especially if they have a lot of looping happening, a lot of OCD or overthinking, a lot of hypervigilance, to just get out a pen and a paper and just journal, just kind of stream of consciousness, get it out of your head. And you mentioned that with kind of breaking the narrative and the cycle with night terrors, and the same idea of just getting out what might be bothering you so that when you go to sleep, it's no longer bothering you, which is helpful. So yeah, that's a great kind of just thinking of it as a wind down before you go to rest. It's the start of your day. Go really slow. It's okay.
Yeah.
Get a nice rest. And when you wake up in the morning, yes. And I know things like blue light, getting blue light and things in the morning, because that kind of starts like a 12 to 15-hour cycle,
Mm.
is things that you do in the morning just as crucial for how you're able to sleep.
I think they're more important than having a nighttime routine. I think
Yeah.
anchoring the circadian rhythm and sleep drive, which is a physical buildup of sleep pressure, starts when we wake up in the morning. But the psychological elements really are what sets us up. Being able to compartmentalize things so that we can turn things off and turn things on when it suits us to.
Mm.
Brain dumping and journaling is really wonderful. I encourage people to practice worry delegation, which is, we're going to write these things down. We're not necessarily going to put our full attention on them all the time. We're going to saying, I'm going to pay attention to this. I'm going to give it some time, but right now I'm going to go choose what I'm going to do. We put
Mm.
ourselves back in the driver's seat instead of feeling flung around by all of the voice that's saying, you have to do this, you have to do that, you can't do this, you must do that. All
Yeah.
of that fear-driven stuff. It doesn't mean that the thing isn't legitimate, but we need to put ourselves in the driver's seat. So setting that aside and then giving it some time,
Mm.
it helps with acknowledging that part of us that's worried, because that part of our brain thinks it's doing us a favor.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like it's trying to keep you safe. So if we just try to silence it, it's just going to scream louder.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, we
Exactly.
got it. We
Very
have to give it time and space, but we have to, again, more of an ACTI type of principle. We can accept that this can exist in our life and we can still go and do these other things, and we can give that time. And we're almost doing like a exposure response therapy by going back to the difficult thing and sitting with it later.
right.
It's
That
like,
makes a
I'm
lot.
not afraid of you. I'm going to sit and deal with you.
Yes. Yeah, that is, and that translates what you just said about, forcing, that translates to everything for any survivor who's listening. That exact concept is, not just pushing away and being resilient. Oh, you've got this and you don't need to. If you tell that part of your brain that is trying to protect you, which, from IFS, internal family systems, all the parts are trying to protect you. They all have a good intention every time, all the time, right? And just pushing them aside is doing your whole system a disservice, because that part will act up to get your attention even more. You've got to meet it where it's at. What are you so worried about? What is happening here? What's going on with you? And then accepting it, just listening to it, witnessing it, which is so beautiful. Tracy,
Yeah.
thank you so much. This conversation, we could go on and on because I have a million more questions about sleep, but I think it's super important for people to take away this idea, that mindset and the attitude shift, just even if they are struggling, to go, hey, okay, I am struggling. It's okay. And you can still do work. And I think that's most of what our recovery journeys look like, is having a both and approach, because yes, I'm happy with where I am right now, and I'm striving and growing to be better, right? I'm happy with how I look right now, and I know I could eat a little bit healthier. Those kinds of acceptance things are super important for people. So I really appreciate your message and your thoughtfulness. I just want to acknowledge you for that. Before we close out here, I always ask all of the guests, while you were in your recovery, I know obviously CBT and ACT must have been huge resources for you in your own recovery, but maybe what were one or two other things that were helpful for you?
Back then, CBT and ACT kind of weren't as popular as they are now. But having had a therapist, but I had a connection who really understood what support really was, I think. Support is not necessarily, in my view, spending a lot of time on the negativity in the story. It's saying, and it's the challenge, it's that loving challenge that says, and now what? Right. So having somebody who could teach me that for myself was huge. It was really, really. Another resource, I think, was being able to be outdoors. We often think, what's the resources? Well, what internet thing can I look up? But I certainly, because of my age, spent a lot of my younger years without the internet or mobile phone. Even after that, even now, being able to just go outside and not necessarily with the headphones in, listening to a podcast. No offense, I am a podcast person and listen to them pretty constantly. To just sit quietly and have that space. And you don't have to you can live in the middle of a city and have only a window to open up and kind of look out. You can take advantage of whatever you have to just take that 5 minutes. And I love doing it in the morning to just get a little light on your face. Doesn't have to be sunny. Doesn't have to be a perfect day.
Yeah. And grounding, I know, is super important. So being outside with nature is really helpful. Yeah, those are beautiful tips. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. Tell people where they can reach out to you, where they can find you, learn more about what you do and the importance of sleep.
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Tracy the Sleep Coach, and does what it says on the tin with my website, tracythesleepcoach.co.uk.
Love that. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.